Dear viewers, hello and welcome. I am Binz, and today's video will be the third video on the topic of creating a Make Anything factory that can deal with floating layers within shapes.io. You may recall from my last video that I devised a categorization method in an effort to rank the complexity of shapes in terms of creating an MAM that can deal with those shapes. Well, I have added 3 new categories to the list for a total of 13 categories. We might have hit the peak, I am not sure yet. Time will tell. Either way, as far as my personal development and understanding of this game goes, I must admit I feel like I'm slowly entering God mode. Now, before we continue, a few shoutouts are in order, particularly a few users who handed me some codes of shapes that I had previously thought to be outright impossible to produce in this game. Turns out I missed an entire dimension of complexity. These users didn't just give me the shape codes, they also pointed me in the right direction in terms of how to get this game to produce them, if not straight up show me how they're done. First and foremost, there is Aiden Andrews. He handed me a shape that he referred to as the bird shape. Now, I don't know why it's called that, but I'll stick with that name tag. He also showed me how he did it, but meanwhile, I found what I feel is an easier method of obtaining the same result. Nonetheless, his giving me a behind the scenes of his bird shape has helped deepen my understanding of shapes.io, which in turn helped me to produce this new MAM that can produce that shape, as well as other shapes that require the same method of producing. The second person I'd like to mention here is user After Fallout 1. He gave me a shape type that I have meanwhile come to call a double-triple quadrant float, and I must say that this is the shape I had by far the most trouble with. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out how it had to be done. He tried to point me in the right direction, but to no avail. So eventually, I turned to the Discord server for help, where it was user Trifnix14 who showed me how to do it. Now, this double-triple quadrant float kind of shape requires what feels to me as an extremely unintuitive approach, and I truly would have never figured out how to get this shape done if it hadn't been shown to me. So, thanks to these 3 people for indirectly helping me to create today's video. While I did end up managing to incorporate the strategies required to create these shapes into my newly built MAM, the mere fact of firstly coming up with these shape forms and then figuring out how to create them in the first place, that was something I feel like I wouldn't have ever come up with by myself in ages. So, having said that, feel free to throw shape codes my way that you think today's MAM can't handle, and you might find yourself receiving a shout out in the next video. Now, what makes these shapes so hard to do? Well, they've all got one thing in common. They require stacking 5 layers on top of each other. And now you may be thinking, hold on a sec, shapes in this game can only have a maximum of 4 layers, right? Right? Unfortunately, it turns out that the truth isn't as straightforward. Have you ever tried stacking more than 4 layers on top of each other? Let's go over it together and see what happens. So I prepared a little machine here that, as you can see, it just gives me a storage of quadrants in different colors, and we're going to have a look at what happens if you try to stack different shapes on top of each other, more than 4. All right, so let's start at the bottom. I'm just going to throw in this white shape, and that gets stacked on top of the purple. Okay, and then we're going to take that output, and we're going to stack it on top of blue. And that is the result that we get. Blue at the bottom, then purple, then white. Then we're going to put that into another stacker. together with the cyan so that we get a shape with 4 layers. And now we are going to stack that on top of green. And as you can see, what will happen is that actually the white layer, the top layer, gets stacked out, so to speak. It gets pushed towards the top and it's seemingly flung into a parallel dimension. And well, if we stack this shape on top of something else, while we're at it, let's keep demonstrating. So if we put that on top of the yellow shape, then you will see that the purple square is also removed from the shape. So each time you do this, each time you exceed 4 layers, the top layer will be removed or pushed out or stacked out, so to speak. Okay? Now, I kind of already knew this mechanic in the game, but I never thought anything of it because I felt confident that there was no situation in which this could ever be beneficial in any way. After all, shapes can have no more than 4 layers. But I was wrong. Exploring these shapes and how to create them led me to realize that the 5th layer is actually still there. You just can't see it. It's not visualized in the shape itself, but an invisible 5th layer may actually still exert influence over the rest of the shape. Now, this fact itself isn't relevant from playing through this game's regular 26 predetermined levels, and therefore it will usually not become apparent to players either, unless, that is, they decide to seriously delve into exploring the in-depth mechanics of this game, like I have now. When you start playing this game and start out with stacking layers on top of each other, the game leads you to interpret what happens as a gravity-based building construction, like a house with several stories. The bottom layer of a shape is the ground floor, the layer stacked on top of that would be the first floor, etc. Just like you build a house from the ground up, you build a shape from the ground up as well. That's a concept that plays into your intuition, or at least it did to mine. But it turns out that shapes should actually be interpreted not like a house, but more like a marionette or a hanging mobile. It is not the bottom layer of your shape that rests on the ground and the layers above rest on top of that, but instead it's the top layer of your shape that is dangling from an invisible ceiling, and the layers below are glued to it. And now, with that realization, a 5th layer that has been stacked out can serve as such an invisible ceiling, and because the game takes the layer into account even though it doesn't visualize it, you can actually dangle suspended layers from that ceiling and open up a whole new dimension of floating quadrant shenanigans on your top layer. Let's illustrate this with the level 26 rocket shape that's caused many a headache. This is the only shape you'll encounter in the regular game that has 3 floating quadrants on it. So I take this shape, I put that into my machine, and now we might have to, wait for a minute until the MAM has this produced. But something we can do in the meantime is take some random shape and get it ready, like so. And now we just wait for a second. Well, this machine takes its time, but we now have the rocket shape produced, and we're going to let that join this random shape. Now, the purpose of what I want to show you is that you can see that indeed, if we stack this random shape below the rocket shape, then you're going to see that the white circle on the rocket shape is being pushed out towards the top. Okay, but the floating layers, the floating red layers below that, they will actually stay intact the way they are with the white circle, right? That is the purpose of what I would like to show you here. Now, another thing I learned in correlation with the exploration of this fifth layer mechanic is that quadrants can only float if they can stick to adjacent layers. Take a look at this example. Mind you, we're looking at this shape from eye level perspective, okay? Not top-down perspective, eye level. So imagine the top two shapes as standing upright, and the bottom two are what you get if you tip them over so they fall flat. That's what the floating layers would look like. For comparison, this is what the shape would look like if all floating layers fell through gravity, okay? So, as I said, quadrants can only float if there is a quadrant on the layer either adjacent above or adjacent below. This is visualized in the image by the fact that in the bottom right representation, the tips of the rectangles touch, right? The fact that they touch is what keeps the float intact. Now, if we were to remove the green and yellow quadrants, like so, then there wouldn't be any connection between the blue and the red quadrants anymore. And the blue quadrant will in fact fall down, but not all the way. It would actually fall down to the second layer. So until one of the edges connects diagonally with a quadrant on the layer below. Let's illustrate this with a live example. So we're going to go back to the game, and I'm going to restore what I broke here. So I'm going to put the trash collector again. There it goes. And then I prepared a little shape that will hopefully illustrate what we're trying to show here. So in this shape, and it's going to take my machine some time to produce it, but we can already have a look at this shape. And the part I would like you to focus on is the fact that on the bottom layer, on the right-hand side, on the bottom layer, it has a red circle quadrant. And on the top layer, the fourth layer, it has a white circle quadrant. But on the right-hand side, because we're exclusively looking at the right-hand side, there are no shapes, no quadrants on the second nor the third layer. That's what I would like you to focus on. So again, we're gonna wait for a second until this shape gets produced. All right, there we go. Now we have that shape. So, and the part I want to show you is that if now you split this in two, then on the right-hand side, the white quadrant falls down, but it doesn't fall down to the bottom layer. It falls down to the second layer. You see this? So this corresponds to what I showed you before, this part. So if you have a layer that falls down, it will actually stick into a floating layer as soon as it touches. Okay? Getting to understand both of these concepts was pivotal in the search for an MAM that can create these new types of shapes. So let's have a look at the actual machine, shall we? Because this machine makes me feel like I'm entering the realm of shapes.io gods, I nicknamed it Deus. Don't worry, I try to be modest and humble, but it's hard because I am truly proud of this factory. Anyway, I have explored plenty of different designs in the past, but for the sake of transparency for myself, that is, I decided on a very linear and parallel design for this one. Let me say in advance that this machine is not very efficient, okay? It's another proof of concept machine, and you can see that the individual modules are pretty far apart at times, and I am 100% sure that this machine can be optimized in terms of compactness and thus efficiency. It is just an effort I haven't made. So, on the left, I now have 17 incoming lines. 17 is an odd number indeed, and that is because they're made up of the 16 input lines you regularly have, one for each quadrant, and then I have a 17th line running all the way at the bottom with white circles. This line is used in cases where we need to stack a 5th layer. I chose white circles purely for aesthetic appeal, but in reality, this can be any colored or uncolored variety of shape. It doesn't matter. The only thing that's important is that this shape has 4 quadrants because it needs to serve as the invisible ceiling to which any of the 4 quadrants below it can attach. All right? So then, for each regular input line, I devised the good old smart cutter and paint mixer combo that I've used on plenty of occasions before. Those of you who've watched my previous stuff, you'll recognize it right away, and I won't dig into how that works today. Every shape and die combo then runs into a simple dual painter module, so I can output up to 16 full lines of any quadrant. From there on out, there is actually only one module type left, and I copied this module across the different output lines, alright? So after the painters, this is just the same module over and over with minor varieties here and there, but essentially the same module. The module consists of 3 parts. The first one is a basic stacking unit that stacks or merges 2 lines into one. Now, I feel like this is actually a pretty good all-around, one-size-fits-all kind of stacking unit because it combines simplicity with efficiency. It works fairly well in a variety of cases, is pretty compact overall, and has a very simple wiring setup. Despite that, it has a bypass mechanic built in that is automatically triggered when it receives only one of both input lines, meaning that it is capable of handling missing quadrants, and it also has a fairly efficient flushing module built in that, when it falls idle, will automatically clear the queues on either side of the stackers. And finally, it also has a storage unit built in at the bottom, which will keep the belts running even if you block or remove the output line, and therefore it keeps your factory from clogging up. And because of that, it is also a pleasant stacker type to work with in your factory while you're still building it. So if you would like to copy this unit and use it for your own purposes, please feel free to do so. This is the only wiring you'll need for it: 3 belt readers, 4 filters, and Bob's your uncle. All right? The second part of this module may be a rotation module actuated by 2 filters, and these 2 filters allow me to rotate a shape either not at all, 90 degrees clockwise, 180 degrees, or 90 degrees counterclockwise. At first, all of my stacking modules had these rotation filters built in, but during testing I noticed that I only needed them in specific instances. So that's why you might notice they're not always there. Finally, there is a cutting unit. This cutting unit will cut the shape in 2, trash the left half, and output the right half. Now, the interesting thing, in case you don't know this, is that cutters in shapes.io also work even if you put partial shapes in. And that's what I'm taking advantage of in this machine. So there's a filter before the cutter and its default position is closed, which in this case means that the cutter is not bypassed, okay? But in the bigger picture, I'm actually only working with right-hand side quadrants, and that is because all of the quadrants that need to end up on the left half of the shape in the final result, I initially rotate those 100 degrees so that they end up on the right-hand side, okay? Now, if such a shape with only right-hand side quadrants runs through this cutting unit, then the end result will be the same as the input, which means it will be the same as if it didn't run through the cutting unit at all. So contrary to, for example, the painters and the stackers, which will stall if they don't have all of the input required for processing, the cutters won't do that. So it's perfectly viable to let a left or right half of a shape run through a cutter, and even if there is no output guaranteed on both lines, the cutter will not stall and the shapes will just continue onwards as if they hadn't run through the cutter at all, alright? Within the bigger picture of this factory, leading the shapes through the cutters by default and only setting the bypass filter to 1 whenever cutting is explicitly not allowed, that turned out to be easier in terms of wiring setup for the entire factory. So in fact, in many cases, shapes will run through these cutter modules even if they don't actually require any cutting at that point. It's just the path they take because either path produces the same output, okay? Finally, there may be 1 or 2 final filters at the end of the module which may redirect the shapes onto a higher or lower tier. This comes into play when you get to the creation of floating quadrants and floating layers. Now, in some cases, this machine might carry out needlessly complex operations. We just talked about the first case. Shapes may run through a cutting module even though there's nothing to cut at that point. But furthermore, shapes may also be redirected up and down sometimes, even if there is no need to. They may be needlessly rotated in a certain amount of degrees first and then rotated back afterwards, and finally, this machine may stack a 5th layer on top, even though the complexity of the final shape doesn't actually require it. All of these decisions and needless maneuvers can be explained by the fact that within the bigger picture, that is the entire factory, the wiring setup proved to be easier if I made the complex maneuvers the default way to go. If the module in question doesn't actually contribute anything to the final shape, however, the result of running that shape through that module isn't otherwise disadvantageous either, then usually the shapes will run through that module. Alright? Alright. Now, it's time to have a look at my categorization table for ranking the complexity of shapes. You will remember this table if you saw my previous video, and obviously if you haven't, I want to invite you to go take a look. The MAM from that video was capable of handling categories 1 through 10, and in that sense I won't be going over those categories in this video anymore. So today we'll have a look at the 3 new categories I devised, which are categories 11, 12, and 13. As you can see, these 3 new categories, as opposed to the previous ones, they require throwing a 5th layer into the mix, which is usually ultimately going to be patched out. The easiest of these is category 11, which contains all shapes that have 3 floating quadrants on the top layer, the 4th layer. Now, once you get into the mindset of 5th layer stacking, this shape is actually fairly simple to do. I would even like to argue that in some cases, in some regards, shapes of category 11 might actually be easier to produce than categories 10 and 9. But let's not get into that level of semantics. Category 11 requires your 17th input line for stacking the 5th layer, whereas lower categories don't. And therefore, let's just keep it simple and say that it's a level up in terms of shape complexity. Okay? Now, the thing is, with these 3 categories, the hardest part after figuring out how to make these shapes in the first place is coming up with a wiring setup that detects when a particular shape belongs to that type. So first of all, you need to figure out what it is that makes this shape. And when you've done that, you need to figure out if the MAM setup that you're working with can still handle and produce that shape. If, for example, you rotate the input 90 degrees, it might be relevant to consider on which layers your floating quadrants are located, how many of them you have, how they are oriented with regards to one another, etc. The higher you move up in these categories I've coined, the more impact these seemingly minor details may come to have. As I also explained about categories 9 and 10 in my previous video, sometimes you simply need to rotate your input wiring signals 90 degrees and send that into processing. And then, after cutting and painting and stacking and whatnot, you need to rotate the final shape backwards again. And while with any regular shape that sounds like a waste of time, starting at certain levels of shape complexity, you will be needing to take that into account. Include certain mechanics in your machine that can either provoke or counteract certain maneuvers and behaviors. And as if that weren't enough, the different wiring modules you come up with that are responsible for detecting a particular type of shape, they also need to stay out of each other's way. And that's slightly easier said than done, because let's look at the wiring module that detects category 11 shapes. It looks pretty complex, right? Well, the thing is that in theory, in order to produce a category 11 shape, the only thing you really need to do is analyze whether that shape has 4 layers or less. If it does have 4 layers, then you may throw your 5th layer into the mix and be done with it without giving it a second thought. That is because adding a 5th layer will not interfere with any of the lower categories. So, if we only take categories 1 through 11 into consideration, then the setup would actually be pretty easy, and we're going to have a look at how you could set it up. So what you could do is just imagine that you take the final signal, okay? Just take the final signal, and you simply unstack it virtually. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. There we go. Connect the lines. And then the only thing you need to do is check whether there is an input on this outgoing line, which would mean that the shape has 4 layers, right? So just take your main input, unstack it virtually, stick on 2 NOT gates to turn a shape value into a Boolean one, and then you could simply attach the output wire to the filter that regulates whether the 5th layer shape is added to your machine or not. Pretty simple, right? If only it were. The thing is, for just the category 11 shapes and lower, that would work fine. But it's the higher categories that pose the problem. Because in this machine, there are actually 4 points of entry for the 5th layer shape into the machine. And in category 12 shapes, it's relevant which one you pick. And in category 13 shapes, finally, as we will see later, they also have 3 quadrants on the top layer. But they require the 5th layer shape to be added into the machine at a different point of entry than the category 11 ones. So this complex looking module does just that. Trigger the filter if we have a category 11 shape, but not otherwise. So how about we let the machine run a category 11 shape, and then we'll have a look at this wiring module. All right? There we go. So here's how the module works. It consists of two nearly identical parts that check whether the shape has 3 floating quadrants or not. The top part will check layers 3 and 4, while the bottom one checks it for layers 1 and 2. Each of these parts is essentially a quadrant counter. It can count how many quadrants you have on any given layer. Now, fasten your seatbelt. I take the input from the right, check whether the shape has 4 layers, and if it does, which will actuate this transistor right here, I feed the top layer of my shape into an analyzer rotation line. The amount of analyzers that have a value will equal the amount of quadrants on the layer. I cut the shape signal so that it gives me the top right quadrant each time, and then I run those signals through a smart stacker. The output of this stack will have the same amount of layers as there are quadrants on our original input layer. So in other words, I'm converting the amount of quadrants into an amount of layers. And that signal I run into a layer counter, which is this final part right here. I also had a layer counter in my previous machine, but for those who haven't seen that, I'll quickly explain. The layer counter unstacks the shape and converts the amount of layers it counts into a shape signal. The shape signal has a value that I assign to it. Specifically, a circle means that the shape has 1 layer, a rectangle 2, a star 3, and a windmill 4. In this specific case, with the line that feeds into the layer counter, having a star for an output means that the top layer has 3 quadrants on it. Are you still with me? So one condition for dealing with a category 11 shape is that the top layer has 3 quadrants. Not only that, and this is the second condition, but the 3 quadrants must also be floating. How do we check that? Well, relatively easy. We take the 3rd layer out of the shape and stack the 4th layer on top. Then we unstack the result of that and check whether the top layer output, which in this case is the bottom output, has a value. If it doesn't, then that means that layers 3 and 4 are floating. If they are floating, I want a 1 signal. So I run it through a NOT gate. Next, the first output is compared with the star shape, and if that outputs a 1 as well as the lane below it, then the AND gate will output a 1, and that will mean that we have a triple quadrant float on the top layer. That's that. Now, the bottom part of the module. As I said, it essentially does the same, but it checks whether layers 1 and 2 have a similar triple quadrant float. In order for the shape to be a category 11 shape, the answer may not be yes, and therefore the signal must be 0. Both signals come together to an XOR gate, which will only output a 1 if one and only one of both signals is a 1. I hope you're still with me. This is the case, and so the signal moves up. The signal may be blocked by a transistor, which isn't currently relevant yet, and then it moves into an OR gate that will open up the filter and insert the 5th layer shape into the stacking module. Alright? So the 5th layer is inserted, stacked on top of the left half of the 4th layer, and then as we move along, the other bits and pieces are gradually stacked below that. Our 5th layer is stacked out, and we ultimately obtain our blue special K shape. That's category 11. Now, let's get to category 12. This is the bird shape that was handed to me by Aiden Andrews. Let's put it in our machine and let it produce that shape. This one is a bit more challenging than the previous category, but actually, once you get the hang of this 5th layer stacking, it's not super hard to do or understand conceptually. So, if we analyze this shape, there is a structure that emerges. On one side, you have 4 alternating floating layers. Top, bottom, all right? The other side of the shape has 3 alternating floating layers. Bottom, top, bottom. Okay? So one side with 4 alternating layers and the other with 3. The challenge is that you want the side with 3 layers to be suspended because the quadrants need to be on layers 2, 3, and 4 rather than 1, 2, and 3. Okay? So the secret is that on the side with 3 layers, you stack a 4th layer that extends over to the other side, like so. And because we have a support now, a ceiling, let's call it, you can hang this shape over the other half, like so. And now, since the combination of both sides produces a shape with 5 layers in total, the top one is automatically stacked out by the game. Yet, as I explained before, it still exerts its influence over the rest, and therefore the float will stay intact. The 3-layered side will stay suspended from the invisible ceiling, leaving you with this final result. Okay? That is how you do it conceptually. Now, let's build this shape together to see how it works in practice. Again, I prepared a little module right here. And what we're essentially going to do is we're going to create both of these halves, just like the example we just saw. So I'm going to get out the red and the gray. Now, since we are working with floating quadrants, we're always going to need this extra quadrant, and I'm going to put it on the top left side. So I'm going to copy this for red, yellow, green, and gray. Okay, and then for the actual quadrants, we're going to take top, bottom. So yellow has to be a clockwise rotation, 90 degrees, top and bottom. Okay, hope that's correct. And then we are simply going to stack them like so. Once again, like so. There we go. There we go. That's that. That's that. We're going to stack that in pairs again, so that we get this, so that we get this, and then we are going to stack that one final time. There we go. Now this is the result, and now we can simply cut off the left hand side and we will end up with this on the right hand side. Okay, that's one half of the shape. Now we're going to do the other half, and I think I can simply copy this, except I have to rotate these things. So red is going to go down, yellow has to be top right, and green can be bottom right again. So again, we let this come out, and we are going to stack these like so, like so, like so, like so. Now I have to wait for a bit and let the shapes flush that had the wrong rotation first. But I think we are good now. Okay. So this is what we get. Okay. We cut that in half. And again, we're going to throw away the left half. And we're going to end up with this. Now, because this is the 3-layered side, we are going to stack a random shape on top of that. Okay? And the important part of this is that it covers both sides, whereas this only covers half. This shape, whatever it is, has to cover both sides. So we are going to stack that. We're going to end up with this result. And now we're going to have the other shape join. And we finally need to rotate this so that it becomes the left half. There we go. And then we can stack this one final time. And we will have the bird shape. Like so. This is it. All right? So that is how you can create a shape of this category. Now, Aiden actually showed me his approach to this shape, yet in hindsight, I feel like his method was perhaps a bit overcomplicated. Stacking the alternating floats left and right and then hanging one side over the other, like I just showed you, it feels like a less convoluted way of achieving the same result to me. Alright then, now, getting the shape produced is one thing. But then I needed to figure out a way to have my MAM handle that. So maybe we should take a small step back and talk about how this machine detects and creates floating bits in the first place, shall we? For that, first we need to move all the way to the left of the machine. You may ignore this huge chunk of wiring for the time being because, trust me, we will get to that. No, the part I'd like to focus on right now is this bit right here that I marked floating. This part of the machine is a literal copy of my previous one, and since I lengthily discussed it in my previous video, I won't go into detail here. The bottom line is that this wiring module compares quadrants on adjacent layers and detects when they float and when not. If they float, and that's the part I want to focus on, the actual quadrant found within the shape will always be output on the bottom line in the pair, while a gray copy is made that moves out the top line. And the really important bit, which is what the rest of the machine uses to build on, is this. If we have a floating quadrant, then the orientation of the original quadrant and its gray copy will be the same. You can see, for example, here that in one case, both the colored quadrant and its gray copy are in the bottom right position, while in the other case, they are both in the bottom left position. It doesn't really matter which position this is because the signals will be rotated later, but the important part is that the gray copy has the same position as the original. Because in cases where we don't have a floating layer, per definition, the quadrant signals of top and bottom output lines will have a different orientation. Per definition. Okay? Now, we're going to move ahead a bit through the machine and rightwards towards these units right here. You can see that the blue lines contain the signals of their quadrant, right? Because of the way I set up the machine from the input to this point, these quadrants can only be either top right or bottom right. So, what this module does is compare the locations of this quadrant pair. I do this with analyzers. If the quadrants have the same orientation, then either the left pair of analyzers or the right will both have outputs. If the quadrants do not have the same orientation and therefore are not part of a floating stack, then there will be a mismatch between the analyzers and none of the AND gates will be triggered. In case we do have a floating stack, one of the AND gates will produce a 1, which through the NOT gate becomes a 0. The 0 is linked to the filters right here, which causes the bottom line to be rotated either 90 degrees clockwise or 180 degrees. If the orientation is top right, then the rotation will be 90 degrees, and if it is bottom right, it will be 180. The quadrants are now stacked while the wires continue on and connect to a set of corresponding rotator filters afterwards. They are going to reverse the rotation, and in turn, the result will be that regardless of whether our actual colored quadrant is located in the top right or bottom right, the complementary gray copy will always be located on the top left. Okay? Additionally, I previously explained how, since we're only dealing with right-hand side shapes, these shapes will run through the cutter modules by default. Remember? In this case, however, where we're dealing with a quadrant located on the left-hand side, the cutter may not be used. I need to bypass it. So, back to the wiring layer. The two lines that come out of my analyzer comparing unit will both be 1 if we're dealing with a regular stack. If we're dealing with a floating stack, then one of both lines will produce a 0. So I connect both lines with an AND gate that will produce a 1 in case of a regular layer and a 0 in case of a floating layer. Next, I compare the output of the AND gate with the one from the module below it, and only if both are 0, it means we're dealing with layers that definitely need to get stacked together without any cutting being allowed. So, I run the output line into 2 filters. The first one ensures that the cutting unit is bypassed, and the second one will cause the shape to not continue right ahead, but instead be redirected downwards to meet the other shape on the layer below, where both will get stacked. Now, usually, the default is that at this point, the shape would get cut and the left half would be kicked out, right? And this brings us back to the category 12 shapes, the bird shape. Because now we need another module that detects that the shape is not allowed to be cut right here either. After all, we're dealing with a shape that has a triple alternation float on one side and a quadruple alternating float on the other, right? That module is located right here. I take the signal of the full shape and cut that into 2 parts. And I run the right part through an unstacker first. I restack the parts and see whether the outcome matches the input, yes or no. This is how I check whether the shape has floating bits or not. At this stage, I feel like that's become super basic procedure already. So if there are floats, the signal may continue to the bottom part of the module, and otherwise the transistor will cut it off. Now, what this part of the module does, it's going to check whether the floating bits alternate. You know, top, bottom, or the other way around. I do this by checking whether the half of the layer in question has only one quadrant on it. I do that by cutting it in half again, and then seeing whether the virtual cutter has an output on both sides or not. The condition for this category 12 shape is that the answer is no. Each layer may only have one quadrant on it. So I do that for all layers, and only if all layers have only one quadrant, the output will be a 1 signal. And in turn, that will cause both the cutting module being bypassed as well as this filter right here to redirect the shape downwards once more where it will meet other layers and be stacked anew there. Okay? Now, an interesting thing is that the modules we just discussed, it detects whether A, there is a floating stack on the quadrant, and B, whether there is only one quadrant per layer. But it is possible that some layers just happen to have one quadrant on one side, without the layer being a floating one. In such case, the wiring module will still output a 1, which bypasses the cutter and moves the shapes down. So it's perfectly possible that some shapes are redirected even though there is no need for it. But that won't matter, because in those cases, the shapes will just take a detour before they eventually reach the end of the line, but they won't be altered or anything. The only important part is that if we're dealing with a category 12 shape, the detour must definitely take place. In other cases, it's irrelevant. So this is another example of a situation where the factory may execute maneuvers that are not necessary, but that made the wiring setup significantly easier while still producing the desired outcome. Alright, but we're not quite there yet. We're currently looking at the part of our shape that has the 3 layers, and that requires the 5th layer to be added into the mix, right? So I bring 2 signals down. On the blue wire, we have the Boolean output of wiring module we just discussed. On the green one, I bring down the final shape signal again. Now, on the green wire, I unstack the shape. And if the top output of the 3rd unstacker contains a signal, then that will simply mean that the shape has 4 layers, okay? If it doesn't, then the transistor will block the blue signal, which causes it to change into a 0 regardless of what it was before. The blue signal, and let's ignore the wire that runs downwards for a moment, the blue signal will move to the right and eventually toggles whether the 5th layer is allowed to enter the system or not. Okay? Now then, keep in mind the bigger picture. Our machine has 2 identical setups. The top part takes care of what will eventually become the left half of our shape. The bottom part deals with the right half of the shape. In the bird shape, in its current orientation, it is the left half that has the 3 alternating layers, and it is also the one to which our 5th layer shape should be connected. Alright? So, the bottom module takes care of the 4 layer right hand side of the shape, and the 5th layer may not be inserted in the system there. Now, remember, the machine is set up so that by default, all lines will just run horizontally from left to right unless instructed otherwise. And the parts we just discussed, the parts that regulate whether the 5th layer may enter the system or not, are located here and here, both on the 3rd layer. Okay? Stay with me. Floating layers are being stacked downwards in my setup. This means that on the top half, where the 3-layer part is created, the top line connects on the 2nd line, is stacked, and the output collects on the 3rd line. The 4th line, meanwhile, is vacant, alright? The bottom modules create the 4-layer part. Here, the top line collects on the 2nd line, and the 3rd line collects on the 4th. Why is that important? It means that in the latter case, on the 3rd line, there will be no traffic on the modules we just discussed. So, let's zoom back in. There we go. Because there is no traffic, no throughput, this belt reader right here outputs a 0, and this 0 will do 2 things. Firstly, it will redirect the shape coming from above once more, because it has to be sent down to the 4th production line where it will meet with the rest. And secondly, it also blocks the 5th layer shape from entering the system at this point. So, the 4 layers come together, get stacked, get cut, because that is the default. Run to the right, to the top, to the right again, to the top again. Join the left-hand side of the shape in a parallel lane, and ultimately, after a long journey, meet each other in the final stacker that will produce the bird shape. And that is one way of, I think, plenty of possibilities to do that. So, I have been rambling on for quite some time now, and whereas any regular person would call it a day here and go, thank you for watching and don't forget to like this video, I'm gonna have to say that the part we just did, this entire shtick, that was the easy part. Now, we're gonna get to the hard part. The shape that was introduced to me by YouTube user after Fallout 1. Your shape, my friend, has made me cry in agony. It made me question the added value of continuing to live. It has caused my therapist to have to go see a therapist. Okay? Okay, I'm exaggerating, of course, but boy, this shape gave me the hardest time of all. Seriously, this took me hours and hours of thinking, contemplating, trying to figure out, and to no avail. At first glance, maybe it doesn't look like it would be that hard. I mean, it's clear that it requires some insight in the game, and beginners wouldn't be able to figure this one out easily either, sure. But for me personally, in terms of complexity between the previous category and this one, the gap is huge. At least as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you feel differently about it, but from my personal grasp on the underlying concepts and mechanics of this game, this shape right here is leagues ahead in terms of how hard I found it to do. So if we analyze this shape a bit, the thing that makes it so complex is the fact that it has two sets of floating layers, both of which have 3 floating quadrants. So there is one quadrant on layer 1, the red one, 3 floating green quadrants on layer 2, 1 blue quadrant on layer 3, and then another set of 3 floating quadrants on layer 4, the white ones. And I pondered and thought and contemplated and reflected and tried and experimented and attempted and retried and tried again, and I simply couldn't figure it out. To the point where I started to wonder whether this was some kind of twisted prank that was being played on me. Seriously. Now, after Fallout 1 himself, or herself, I don't know, tried to give me hints as to how I should get there, but I still didn't manage. I felt like I had hit a ceiling, just a glass ceiling that my brain was bumping into and was consistently met with contempt. Not you, my friend, only people with IQs higher than their age should be allowed on this floor. So eventually I turned to the Shapes.io Discord channel for help, and within minutes of asking, I was sent this screenshot by Discord user Trifnix14, and my mind was absolutely blown to bits. Because this is actually not that hard to do. At the bottom, you start out with your 5th layer. Okay, I get that. And you stack it on top of half of the white circles. You create a triple alternating float on the bottom 2 quadrants. Okay, I know how to do that. Stack it below. Stack it on top of a single quadrant. Got it. And create another floating pair and stack that below. Easy peasy. It is not that hard. But truth be told, this approach is so unintuitive for me that I wouldn't have figured this one out. I just wouldn't have figured it out without foreign help. I just have to be honest about that. So thanks to Trifnix14 for shattering the ceiling for me and pulling me up to that floor. For real. Thank you. That was amazing. No questions asked. Just here you go. Here's how you do it. I am very thankful for that one. But it turned out that for this particular shape, knowing how to do it was one thing, but integrating the concept into my MAM was something entirely different still. Because contrary to Aidan Andrews' bird shape, which I figured out relatively quickly once I knew how to make the shape, in this case, figuring out how to incorporate that into my MAM was an at least equally long journey. I was less than halfway there. So I'll quickly let the machine do another shape right now, which is the same concept, but has one quadrant of each color for transparency. I think the main reason why this shape is so hard to figure out and to construct is this. A shape can consist of 16 quadrants, and 16 equals 2 to the 4th. This implies that you can usually build your shapes by starting with 16 quadrants, stack them into 8 halves, stack that into 4 layers, stack that into 2 double-layered shapes, and stack that into your final shape, right? So in each step of the stacking process, the amount of output lines is halved, and that approach doesn't work with this shape. This one requires a different approach. So let's illustrate this by building this shape, all right? I prepared a little factory that can create the shape we currently need. I have square quadrants on stock in each color, plus a random 5th layer shape that we will use for discarding later. Let's connect the lines up like so. The red and the yellow squares need to join, and the yellow one must float. So we connect those, okay? Then we need green, blue, and purple into an alternating float stack as well. So we connect those up as well. Next, we need cyan and gray in a regular merge. So there we go. We need the white quadrant to stay separate, okay? And finally, our 5th layer shape. And if we connect all of those components, which also require an order of operations that differs from business as usual, then we get the output we want. So the thing is that when I input this shape into my machine, the way of analyzing the layers, detecting which layers need to float and which don't, etc., it just doesn't work for this shape. The shape doesn't play well with the divide by 2 setup that this MAM, and I guess pretty much any MAM, uses. I think this picture pretty much sums it up, right? So I started experimenting with siphoning off certain quadrants, redirecting them into different stackers, tampering with the wiring to provoke certain rotations and counter rotations, you name it. But no matter what I came up with or tried to do, it would completely fall apart if I rotated the input as much as 90 degrees clockwise. So after a lot of swearing, I came up with something that I like to believe was kind of a badass move. Instead of feeding the shape into the machine and then juggling around with the bits and pieces until the world ends, what if I manipulated the input signal instead, so that when I feed that into the machine, it spontaneously produces the components I'll eventually need? Congratulations, Bins. You have entered the realm of Shapes.io gods. After digging deeper into that idea, I found out that I could get the shape produced relatively easily, mind you, relatively easily, if I could somehow manage to mold this input signal into this one. Because it's a lot easier for my machine to extract the components I'll need from the upper shape. On the right, a triple alternating float of blue, yellow, purple on the bottom. This one. Then a gray, cyan, normal pair on top. That's this one. Next, on the left-hand side, the white quadrant at the bottom, which we will need separately from anything else. That's this one. And finally, a red-green pair with a floating green quadrant. That's this one. and then a disposable fifth layer, but that was the least of my worries. Now, turning one shape into another sounds easier than it is, especially with this kind of shape where the parts that need to float need to stay together. But I am proud to announce I hacked the code. So let's get back to the wiring layer and move all the way to the front of the machine. This oversized and complex looking wiring module right here, that's the one responsible for analyzing the category 13 shapes and manipulating the input. Let me stress again, I am proud of this. The input signal is right here on the blue wire. We follow it to the top left, where it will firstly run into this machine. Now, the characteristical trait of these category 13 shapes is that they have two pairs of triple quadrant floats. So that means one quadrant on the first layer, three on the second, one quadrant on the third layer, three on the fourth, okay? So the first thing I do is cut each layer up into quadrants and run the four potential signals into an analyzer rotation module. I take the shape part off each one and run those signals into a smart stacker, and the smart stacker runs into a layer counter, like the one we've seen before. Now, I do this for all four layers, and since the distribution of the shapes per layer is 1, 3, 1, 3, the output signals that I check for are circle, star, circle, star. All right? The output signal runs into an AND gate, which we are going to ignore for the time being. But if the AND gate produces a 1 signal, then it means we're dealing with a shape of this type. If so, the transistor will allow the original signal to pass into the giant conversion module. Now, at first, the way I approached the shape was in terms of location. Now, what I mean by that is that, for example, I said, okay, the quadrant located in the top right of the first layer will eventually need to become the bottom left quadrant of the second layer. The bottom right quadrant of the second layer needs to become the top right quadrant of the second layer, etc. But that approach didn't get me anywhere, because it turned out it only worked with this particular shape, but it failed the rotation test, which would produce an entirely different outcome. So that didn't work. Instead, I needed to start thinking about this shape in terms of rotation and relative layers. So if the red square is the first layer quadrant, then the green square is the one that's located 90 degrees clockwise on the layer above it. The blue one, 180 degrees, the white one, 90 degrees counterclockwise, etc. That approach got me where I needed to go. So, I take the top layer off and I run that into a small rotation device that is governed by the third layer with a yellow square. By analyzing the position of the third layer quadrant, I can make sure that the virtual cutter gives me, from top to bottom, respectively, the quadrant positioned 90 degrees clockwise with comparison to the yellow one, in this case the cyan square, then the quadrant diagonally opposite of it, in this case the gray one, and thirdly the one positioned 90 degrees clockwise, or the purple one. Employing the same rotation analysis thing, I rotate these quadrants once more so that they get back to their initial positions. So in the end, they make a full 360-degree rotation. I repeat this process for the second layer of the shape with regards to the first, and this ensures that I always get the quadrants that have the correct relative orientation to each other, in order from top to bottom. And this is something I can consistently stack. So then I run the signals into virtual stackers, rotators, blah blah blah, and get the stacked shape right here. The last thing I do is ensure that the bottom quadrant of this outcome is always positioned in the top right corner of this shape. I do this with another small analyzer module that will produce a circle signal in case that quadrant is already where it's supposed to go, a square if we need a 90-degree clockwise rotation, a star for 180 degrees, and finally a windmill for 90 degrees counterclockwise. This means that regardless of where the bottom quadrant is actually located, the shape I'm feeding into the machine will always have its bottom quadrant in the top right corner. And you can see that this circle signal runs to the right and upwards. That signal runs all the way until the end of the machine, where it will actuate a counter rotation so that the output matches the final result we want. This new shape is fed into the machine, and we can see that the shape signals that are output match the components we'll need in our final shape. From top to bottom. Wait, let me get the screenshot back. So, from top to bottom, we get nothing, nothing, a green quadrant with a gray copy, which induces a floating stack, a red quadrant with a gray copy that we'll need together with the green one in order to get this floating pair done, a white quadrant, solo, and now since this is the part of the machine that produces the left half of the shape, let's scroll down where we will get a cyan gray pair, but the gray is not a copy because you can see that the orientation is not the same between the two of them, okay? That will produce this bit right here. And then a purple quadrant with a gray copy, a yellow quadrant with a gray copy, and finally a blue quadrant with the gray copy. These are all the components we need, and from this point, redirecting the shapes and the lanes towards where they need to go and bringing them together in the correct order was child's play compared to what we saw before. So, if we zoom through the machine a bit, we can see that everything comes together the way it needs to. The disposable fifth layer comes first, the cyan gray pair is stacked below, the alternating 3-layer float comes together with the single white quadrant. They move up, get stacked, and finally meet up with the red-green float, and that is input into the stacker as well. And all the way at the end of the line, after what is essentially a massive detour behind the scenes, we get our ultimate shape. Hot damn. The two rotators at the end right here, they're only used in cases of a category 13 shape. So if I rotate the input signal 90 degrees, then the shape that the machine will produce is exactly the same one. The only thing that changes is that all the way at the end right here, the shape will be rotated one final time in its entirety, either 90, 180 or 270 degrees counterclockwise, depending on what the output signal of our little module at the start of the machine exactly is. That line runs all the way from the start to the end, toggling these two final filters. Now, we are still not there yet. There is another thing to consider, and that is that if we look at this shape and pay attention to the red and the yellow quadrants, which are the sole quadrants on the first and the third layer respectively, then the yellow one's orientation is 90 degrees clockwise compared to the red, okay? This is relevant because let me put in a different shape now. Let's see, concept blocks counterclockwise. There we go. In this shape, the yellow square has an orientation of 90 degrees counterclockwise compared to the red, and it turns out that that requires a slightly different manipulation of the source than the previous one does. All right? So let's get back to our initial analyzer module and zoom in on the appendage in the top left corner. This module figures out, in case of a category 13 shape, what the orientation of the single quadrant on the third layer is compared to that of the first layer. Okay? I single those quadrants out, in our case the red and the yellow squares, right? And I run them into two very similar looking modules. The left module is the one that applies to this case, which means that if we rotate the yellow square once, it will have the same orientation as the red one. In that case, the module will output a circle signal. In the other case, the previous case, the right module would trigger. If we rotate the red square once and obtain the same orientation as the yellow one, then we will get a square signal at the top. So right now, we've got a circle signal on our wire, and let's follow it to the right, and down into the AND gate that I previously told you to ignore for the time being. Remember? The green signal is matched with a square, and in this case, there is a mismatch because we've got a circle, okay? And so our AND gate does not get both input signals it needs to output a 1, which in turn means that the source signal is not allowed to travel into our manipulation module. But we have a similar module right here. This module is triggered if the green wire contains a circle shape, which it is in our current case. So this module is close to identical, except it restacks the original shape differently ever so slightly. Now, this circle signal also runs quite a bit to the right, so let's follow it. Run, 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 run. Here it is. And remember, this circle signal differs from this circle signal. The circle signal on the green wire is connected to the filters all the way at the end of the machine, which determines how we're going to rotate the end result, if at all. The circle signal on the blue wire is connected to various filters and rotators within the machine, which at this time I feel is already peanuts compared to the rest. So I don't think I'm going to bother following these wires around and going into detail about where they connect, etc. So let's do one final shape. I called this one Galaxy Brain Timepiece 10 past 10. I gave it this name because I feel it looks like a clock, but the principle is the same. It has two pairs of triple quadrant floats, and in this case, the big red dial is located 90 degrees clockwise compared to the smaller blue dial. As you can see, this machine takes its time, but eventually it will get the shape done. I also have the reverse, which is the timepiece 10 to 2, which you'll see if we give it some time, the machine is equally capable of producing. Now, a final remark regarding this category 13 shapes. At this point, I am not sure whether it's possible to get a shape of this type created in which the third layer quadrant is located diagonally from the first layer one. I have a hunch that it can't be done. But then again, I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again someday, so who knows. And I guess after what feels like an immensely long video, we can finally get to the end. I once again invite you to throw shapecodes my way that you think this machine can't handle, and in case I can prove you wrong, I will gladly do so. But if it turns out that you can give me a code for a valid, producible shape that this MAM cannot handle, then you might well be responsible for the next video in the series. So, this is it, my Deus machine. As always, I hope you had fun watching. Maybe you learned a thing or two, and maybe I inspired you to get to work on your own MAM designs again. If so, feel free to leave a comment. Wishing you all a lovely day. Bins out. Bye-bye.